Aveline by Munster Adams. Under a sky that churned like an ocean of shadows, thick with storm clouds roiling as if alive with the restless souls of the damned, Aveline made her way home. She moved with the weariness of one who had endured far too much, yet she pressed on, driven by a gnawing instinct, a foreboding she couldn't explain, a dared not ignore. Her heart pounded in a strange, frantic rhythm, each beat a portent of something terribly wrong. The Welsh cottage loomed ahead, its crimson windows like bloodshot eyes, ivy-veined walls clinging in nature's dark embrace. Under an ink-black sky she approached, and the door creaked as it swallowed her into silence. Inside, the air hung thick, laden with whispers that curled like cold fingers around her skin. Her father lay crumpled near the hearth, his once commanding presence stilled forever, his eyes wide and staring into nothing. Beside him lay her grandmother, frail body twisted in death, mouth frozen in a silent scream. Across the room, Aveline's younger sister lay curled as if in sleep, her small, fragile body void of life. Her mother sprawled beside her, her gown torn, her gentle face marred by horror. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay, mingled with a silence so profound it seemed to press the walls inward. Aveline staggered forward, her mind barely able to process the devastation. Each face shattered her heart anew, each body a reminder of life and love stripped away in an instant. But before she could grieve, before she could even comprehend the depth of the loss, she felt a cold, iron grip on her shoulder. They had waited for her, sent by the man she had once loved, a man she had believed golden-hearted, yet whose soul was black as the night around her. They dragged her to the ground, their hands rough and merciless, tearing at her clothes, holding her down as she struggled, her cries muffled by their laughter. Calloused hands violated her in ways that left scars deeper than any knife could carve. She bit down hard, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her screams, even as they tore at her innocence, defiling her spirit. Then came the knife, a sharp, cold pain blooming in her shoulder. But she barely registered it. Her vision was already fading as her life spilled out, pooling on the floor in a dark, viscous puddle. She was barely conscious as they lifted her, tossing her body like a broken doll onto her family's remains, piled in the shallow grave hastily dug in the garden. The earth began to fall, each shovelful pressing down on her chest, filling her mouth, clogging her nostrils, until she could barely breathe. She lay there, surrounded by the bodies of her family, their once warm flesh now cold and lifeless against her own. She could feel the weight of the soil pressing down, darkness closing in around her, but as her vision dimmed, a single thought blazed through her mind. She would not die like this. She would not allow herself to be buried, to be silenced. With every ounce of strength, she clawed her way through the dirt, tearing at roots and stones, her nails breaking, her skin ripping. She fought against the earth that sought to claim her. Each handful of dirt she cast aside a scream of defiance. Her shoulder throbbed with agony, her body weakened by blood loss, but her spirit burned with fierce, unyielding rage. She would not rest. She would not surrender. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her hand broke through the surface, fingers clawing into open air as she pulled herself free, gasping, her body trembling with the effort. She was no longer the woman she had been, no longer the innocent girl who had dreamed of love and happiness. That girl had been buried in the grave she had just clawed her way out of, left behind with the bodies of her family. Now she was something else entirely, something forged in pain, honed in suffering, sharpened by a thirst for vengeance that consumed her soul. She staggered to her feet, bloodied and battered, her heart beating with a new, dark purpose. She would make them pay. She would see justice done, even if she had to burn the entire world to achieve it. Her journey began that night, a pilgrimage of darkness and despair. She walked through fields where shadows whispered secrets, crossed moors where fog drifted like the souls of the forgotten, passed through forests where ancient trees leaned in, bearing silent witness to her pain. She moved as though guided by an unseen force, an insistent whisper calling her to a place steeped in myth and legend, where gods of vengeance still lingered, waiting for a soul desperate enough to call upon them. At the base of an ancient hill, its slopes dotted with stones worn smooth by time, its summit crowned with remnants of forgotten altars, she knelt upon the cold, hard ground, her bare skin exposed to the chill night air. She raised her hands to the heavens, holding a dark chalice, an ancient vessel forged from metal as old as the stones beneath her, its sides etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light of the dying sun. She poured her blood into the chalice, each drop a silent prayer, a plea to the gods of old to hear her call, to grant her the power needed to avenge the lives so cruelly taken. As she lifted the chalice high, the sky darkened further, and from the shadows emerged a figure of grotesque magnificence. Neither beast nor man, it was a fearsome blend of both, its horns spiraling from a mane of shadows, eyes gleaming with a malevolent intelligence that pierced her very soul. This was no benevolent god. It was a creature born of shadows and secrets, a being whose very existence was a hymn to forgotten nightmares. The creature gazed upon her, weighing her every sin, sorrow, and ounce of anguish. She could feel its power pressing down, an overwhelming, suffocating force filling every inch of her body. Yet she did not falter. She held its gaze, her eyes blazing with the fire of hatred, her heart a furnace of wrath that no earthly force could extinguish. She was here to make a bargain, to offer herself body and soul in exchange for the vengeance she craved. Once she had known love, pure, blinding love that had consumed her, leading her to surrender everything. She had given herself to a man who promised eternity, whose wealth and charm made her believe in fairy tales. But when their affair was discovered, his love turned to cruelty, his heart a fortress of ice that hid a soul as cold as death. He had betrayed her, ordered her family slain, their lives taken without mercy, their bodies discarded like refuse. She had returned to a home-turned tomb, and in the silence of that grave, something inside her had died. And so, she knelt before this ancient deity, her voice a whisper filled with the promise of blood and death, her blood an offering to seal the dark pact she had come to make. She felt the deity's approval settle over her like a shroud, its presence pressing down with a weight that drove her into the earth, binding her to the darkness, to the shadows that writhed and shifted at the edge of her vision. As the sky darkened further, visions rippled before her eyes. In her mind, she saw her lover tormented by shadows, rising from every corner, specters clawing at him with hands of bone, faces twisted in agony. She saw him stumbling through the empty halls of his mansion, pursued by silent echoes of the lives he had destroyed. She heard the faint, mournful cries of her family, her mother, her sister, her father, all sacrificed for his pride. And as these visions passed, Aveline felt a grim satisfaction, a dark pleasure that pulsed through her with an intensity colder than death, fiercer than life. Rising from her knees, she turned from the hill, feeling the earth shift beneath her feet, guiding her toward a place of death and decay. She walked until she reached a forgotten graveyard, hidden in the shadow of ancient trees, a cemetery as old as memory itself, where the dead lay in restless silence. The graves were twisted and sunken, The tombstones choked with moss and lichen, their inscriptions worn to faint whispers. Yet amidst this decay, figures began to stir, ghastly forms shrouded in sickly ectoplasmic residue that clung to their bones like rotting cloth. These were spirits of the forgotten, souls trapped in torment, summoned forth by her sacrificial promise. They rose, skeletal forms draped in a shimmering, sickly green ectoplasm, faintly pulsing with ancient malice. Aveline felt them before she saw them, the chill of their presence, the whisper of death that slipped through the air with each movement. They waited, half risen from their tombs, bony hands extended, trailing decay. These were not mere ghosts. They were beings of pure vengeance, drawn forth from silent graves to serve her cause. Aveline reached out, feeling a connection, a communion of despair and wrath. They recognized her, saw a kindred spirit, someone whose suffering mirrored their own. She felt the weight of their ancient grievances, their hunger for justice. Standing among them, she whispered a command, her voice low and venomous, the syllables slipping into the night like poison. The spirits nodded in silence, their empty eyes fixed on her with reverence reserved only for the divine. In her mind's eye, Aveline saw phantoms already haunting the halls of her betrayer's manor, trailing him like shadows upon shadows, their ectoplasmic forms slipping through walls and windows, leaving trails of decay and rot. She saw him catching glimpses in the corner of his eye, like mist on a mirror, a whisper behind closed doors. On nights when the moon was full, she knew these specters would materialize before him, skeletal figures rising from the darkness, hollow eyes staring into his very soul, forcing him to confront the horror he had unleashed. Turning from the graveyard, Aveline led her spectral court into the depths of night. The fog rose around her feet like an obedient creature, swirling upward to envelop her in ghostly tendrils. With each step, it climbed higher, winding around her, touching her skin with a chill that seeped into her bones. The mist traced the outline of her body, pulling at the fabric of her garments until they unraveled, dissolving into the fog itself. She stood vulnerable beneath the moonlight, strangely unburdened by any sense of shame. She was no longer bound by mortal constraints. She was something else, something forged in darkness, draped only in the mist that clung to her, shifting to obscure and reveal her form with each movement. Her dark congregation followed in silence, skeletal forms nearly hidden within the fog, empty eyes fixed on her with devotion that bordered on worship. Her hair, once bound, now cascaded freely over her shoulders, merging with the mist that drifted around her in waves, making her appear as though she were part of the night itself, a phantom leading an army of the dead. In the distance, her destination loomed, the grand estate of the man who had betrayed her, its towers and spires dark against the night sky. The manor stood like a tomb upon the hill, its stone walls cold and unyielding. Within, she sensed fear trembling in every shadow. As she approached, the mist poured over the grounds, seeping from the earth as though summoned, pressing against doors and windows, wrapping the manor in an eerie embrace that grew denser and darker with each passing moment. The silence settled heavily around her as Aveline walked through the rotting wheat fields, each step weighted by monstrous memories. Her mind pulsed with images of her mother's gentle face, twisted in terror, her younger sister's innocence shattered. All blazed through her mind with merciless clarity. A wound throbbed within her, deeper than any physical hurt, born of betrayal and endless grief. She had loved him, hard-bound to his promises, his whispers of forever, his golden words that had once felt like salvation. But his love had been a lie, a twisted game that had cost her everything, leaving her alone, wretched, bound to a graveyard of memories. As Aveline neared the estate, The spectral presence around her grew stronger, thickening the air like a suffocating shroud. She felt their silent, watching eyes, souls drawn to her suffering, recognizing her rage as their own. Each step felt like a communion with them, an unspoken pact bound by mutual pain and vengeance. Her skin tingled, her body alive with the cold touch of death, as though she herself was slipping further into that spectral void from which none ever returned. A strange sensation lingered in the depths of her mind, a dark whisper, an echo, barely perceptible, but pulsing with a seductive weight, like an invisible hand reaching from the shadows. It pressed against her thoughts, a presence that recognized her suffering, her thirst for vengeance, wrapping around her memories with a possessive, intimate hold. And then it was gone, leaving only a chill that drove her forward, closer to the mansion's looming doors. Inside the manor, a male servant moved through the dim hallway, oblivious to the creeping mist slithering at his heels. The specters followed Aveline's silent command, their translucent forms passing through walls, gliding through corridors with a predatory grace. One specter, a hollow-eyed woman in burial shrouds, tattered and stained with age, fixed her gaze upon the servant, her empty eye sockets blazing with malice. He turned as a sudden chill brushed his skin, a feeling like icy fingers slipping beneath his collar. He shuddered, hands fumbling to adjust his collar, but the specter was already upon him. As her hands grazed his form, his clothing shredded beneath their ethereal grip, her presence wrapping around him, pulling him into an intimate, agonizing embrace that breached both his mind and flesh. He let out a strangled gasp, body frozen in terror as the sensation drained him, his flesh paling to the color of cold ash before he crumpled to the floor, lifeless. In the grand hall, a maid paused, sensing something in the air, a warning carried on the fog that had begun to seep through the walls. Her gaze darted around, confusion quickly giving way to fear as she spotted a figure emerging from the mist. She turned to flee, but a second specter blocked her path, skeletal hands stretching toward her with a consuming hunger. She froze, her uniform ripping under the spectral hands that reached for her, each touch pressing cold against her skin, as if slipping through her very being. Her scream echoed through the hallway, swallowed by the mist, her flesh pulled into their frigid grasp as she felt herself breaking under the caress. Every touch was agony yet intoxicating, filling her with an endless fear, the horror mingling with a faint, forbidden rapture. She sank into silence, body slumping as her spirit faded, leaving only the ghostly echo of her final breaths. Her steps carried her deeper into the manor, guided by the unrelenting pull of her own wrath. In a distant room, her lover's grandmother slept, a woman steeped in cold, ancient cruelty, her silver hair spilling over embroidered pillows. She had known of Aveline's suffering, had condoned it with a silent nod, her twisted pride mirroring that of her grandson's. As the specters gathered around her bed, she stirred, eyes fluttering open to see hollow faces leering down at her. They did not touch her flesh as they had with the others. Instead, they leaned in close, whispers of death slipping into her ears, pouring secrets of horror and anguish into her mind. She whimpered, a frail, trembling sound that grew into a scream as the specters continued, weaving their curse into her thoughts until her sanity splintered, shattering like glass. She lay motionless, her once piercing eyes now empty, her mind a hollow shell. In the nursery, her lover's sister rocked her infant son to sleep, unaware of the creeping mist coiling around her feet. As the fog thickened, she rose to close the door, only to freeze in horror as ghostly skeletal figures materialized from the shadows. Her eyes went wide, her grip tightening around the child as the first specter reached for her, its icy hand grazing her cheek, leaving a line of frost in its wake. Panic flooded her as more hands reached toward her, each touch freezing the blood in her veins. She clutched her baby to her chest, backing against the wall. But there was no escape. The specters pressed in, hollow eyes gleaming with unearthly hunger as their fingers tore at her clothing and flesh with a dreadful, methodical patience. She let out a strangled scream as spectral hands grazed her child's skin, his innocent face paling, eyes wide in helpless fear as he too felt the spectral touch of death. Her own life slipped away with every touch, her body sinking to the floor, her arms falling limp as her child's final breaths mingled with her own. Together, mother and child faded, their souls claimed by the ghostly forms that had slipped back into the shadows. Down another corridor, the woman he had chosen over Aveline cowered in terror, her silken gown tangled around her feet as she fled toward the servants' quarters. She stumbled, falling to her knees, clutching at the walls for balance as she heard the whispering echoes of Aveline's vengeful specters creeping ever closer. They surrounded her, ghostly forms encircling her like vultures, hollow eyes glowing with dark delight. She felt skeletal hands upon her, one ghostly touch after another, tracing the lines of her face with a grotesque, chilling tenderness. Her lips parted in a silent scream as the specters leaned in, fingers brushing down her arms, across her collarbone, pressing cold and unrelenting into her very essence. Every caress sapped her spirit, blending fear and horror with a dark, intoxicating dread. She felt her life slipping away under their relentless touch, a deep and lingering horror that filled her with despair. Her once vibrant face grew pale, her body slumping as her final breath mingled with the fog, her spirit torn from her body by the cold touch of Aveline's vengeful ghosts, leaving her forever etched into the manor's cursed memory. As Aveline drifted deeper into the manor, she could feel herself changing, her skin paling, her limbs beginning to grow translucent, her very essence slipping further from life's tether. And again, she felt the whisper, darker, richer, weaving through her mind like the faintest caress, almost a lover's murmur. It wrapped around her sorrow and wrath, whispering to her of vengeance not as an end, but as the beginning of something far more consuming, something that would bind her to a power beyond life itself. She felt it slither through her thoughts, a seductive darkness that filled her with a sinister intimacy, and then it was gone, leaving her to the silent fury that drove her steps forward. Her former lover sensed her presence before she even entered his chamber, the fog slipping beneath the door like a silent, vengeful tide. He clasped a gilded cross to his chest, whispering frantic prayers to a god he had never honored, his face a mask of pure, mortal terror. When the door opened, he choked, his eyes widening as he saw Aveline standing before him, framed in mist, her hair swirling around her as though alive, eyes burning with a spectral fire that seemed to pierce his very soul. She took a step forward, her bare feet soundless on the marble floor, the fog rising to encircle her like a shroud. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper filled with the cold weight of her curse. We linger, suffer, anguish. You shall die. His mouth moved, but no sound escaped. His voice lost to the choke of fear as her specters gathered around him. They descended, skeletal hands reaching for him, not with claws or teeth, but with a soul-deep emptiness that began to consume him from within. He screamed, his cries brittle, shattering in the oppressive silence, his flesh paling as the specters drained his essence, leaving nothing but a hollow shell, a body robbed even of the dignity of death. And then, in the final moments of her transformation, Aveline felt it. The voice of the elder god, no longer distant, now fully present, filling her thoughts with a triumphant murmur that wrapped around her soul like a dark lover's embrace. "You are mine now, my queen of shadows. Together, we shall walk the realms beyond, bound by wrath, joined in the mysteries of death." Aveline felt the last trace of her human self fade as she turned from the carnage, her form, no longer bound to flesh, dissolving into the fog. She drifted out of the manor, her figure a whisper of mist as she reached the edge of the fields, looking back at the mansion, now shrouded in darkness, a tomb of terror and despair that would forever hold the memory of her wrath. In the faint light of dawn, a spectral form lingered, a whisper of vengeance drifting through the fields, leaving behind only silence, a silence that would haunt the manor and every soul within, for eternity. As Aveline looked on, her form began to change fully, her flesh paling, her limbs growing entirely translucent. Her fingers stretched, sharpened, becoming claws of spectral energy, her hair floating around her as though suspended in water. She felt the life leaving her body, replaced by a dark, icy presence that surged through her veins, a transformation that erased every trace of her former humanity. She was no longer Aveline, the woman betrayed. She was a specter of vengeance, a creature of wrath, bound by ancient, primal rage. The manor walls shuddered as her power pulsed, rippling through the very stones, the echoes of her fury embedding themselves in every corner, every creak of the ancient floorboards. She did not drift away from the ruin of her lover's life. Instead, she felt herself sinking into the heart of the house itself. Her essence seeped into the walls, flowing through the twisted architecture, claiming every darkened corridor and hollow room as her own. She felt her form dissolve, merging with the shadows and whispers, her presence spreading outward like the roots of an ancient, cursed tree. The house became an extension of her being, its very foundation steeped in the agony, betrayal, and rage that bound her to this place. Every window, every door, every inch of stone and wood pulsed with her wrath. The grounds beyond, the graveyard with its sunken tombstones, the barren fields where her family's blood had stained the earth, all of it fell under her watch. She was the breath in the dead air, the chill that crept up the walls, the silent murmur that threaded through the creaking rafters. And so, Aveline became the soul of the manor, her presence woven into the walls and floors, a permanent shadow cast over the house and the grounds that surrounded it. To any who dared cross its threshold, she would linger in every whisper, every flicker of candlelight, her gaze watching from the empty rooms, her touch felt in the sudden drafts that clawed down the hallways. Her lover's final scream, frozen forever within the house's bones, would echo softly in the dead of night, a reminder of the curse she carried. No soul would enter without feeling the weight of her anguish, the horror of her betrayal. Every shadow would become her, every chill her breath, each step her heartbeat. She was the house, the grounds, the darkness that pooled around the gravestones, waiting for those who dared disturb the silent halls. In the faint light of dawn, the house stood in a silence that would never be broken, shrouded in darkness, a tomb of terror and despair. And within it, Aveline lingered, her spirit bound to the place, a haunting echo that would fill the air for eternity, forever guarding the memory of her vengeance.